and we're going to, notice it's particularly wide. What we're going to say is that was not. You notice it's not really a grid pattern. It doesn't what it does is it follows old established indigenous trails. Okay, and so it's not, so that old established indigenous trail that later on becomes a street called Wall Street. I'm sorry, they're called Broadway. Okay, so we see kind of the way that the way that say Lower Manhattan kind of looked in the 1660s. We see that there is no grid pattern. It's kind of low buildings. It's very, very small, and it's fortified. One of the reasons why it's fortified is because because they were protecting themselves from indigenous people who were not happy about some Europeans coming and putting and setting up shop in their and setting up shop in their territory without and claiming like that it's theirs. We're going to claim this for the Dutch. Okay, let's see. Okay, so a little bit more. There's more I can say. Oh, I'll just say this, of course. Now, if we turn the map counterclockwise, if you'll see the west at the very tip, at the very end of Wall Street, at the very far end of Wall Street, that would be on the East River. Okay, there was a very, very large, the largest in North America for a very long time. There was a very large slave market. Okay, so one thing, for the importing and sale of enslaved Africans. And we'll say more about that in a minute. But what we will say is, since that is Wall Street, that later becomes Wall Street, we will say that enslaved Africans were essentially the first commodity traded on Wall Street. Okay, so I'll say a lot about that in a little bit. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about the population of these colonial cities, right? Of these tiny colonial cities. They were established by and for European countries, and for the 13 original colonies that made up the first states of the United States. This was mostly established by England. Right, they were small. Like I said, that should be less than that says less than 10,000 people. Early on, more like less than 1,000 people, but they grew, particularly like New Amsterdam grew and Boston grew. Right, but they were small. They were ethnically and religiously homogeneous. Right, they were so it's not they're not diverse. They weren't diverse in the way that we think of cities today. Right, Jamestown was established by England. Right, and by the Virginia Company of London. Right, it was established by England, and so it had English people there. It was an English colony, and outside of the enslaved Africans who were there, the English were the folks who were there. The same with the New Amsterdam colony was established by the Netherlands, established by the Dutch West India Company. Notice these are companies, right? The way that worked is that in order to finance the establishment of these colonies and exploratory missions for trade missions and to say like the New World, what European monarchs would do is they would gather together bunches of investors, right? People who are interested in making lots of money, and they would gather those people together and get them to invest in this mission to go and get a bunch of money. Those were called companies, right? Those were like, and early on, that was the establishment of the first corporations within under capitalism. So I'll say a little bit more about religious freedom. A lot of times we hear that, oh man, like the Puritans and the Quakers and the Pilgrims, if you will, they came over to the New World for religious freedom, and it is true that some colonies were established by utopian, like kind of religious communities, essentially places. So the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts because in order to establish basically, and even not religious freedom, like, hey, we can be what we want, but essentially to establish a more authoritarian and a more kind of oppressive kind of Calvinist kind of religion in their own place, because they were very critical of what they saw as the liberalism of Calvinism in Europe. Right. So utopian is that's a stretch, or at least it would be a stretch for anybody there who was not trying to follow the rules or was trying to do their own thing. Okay, so, but let's not, but we want to be clear. Yes, it is true that they came to establish themselves for a kind of religious freedom, if you will, due to their remoteness. We have to be clear that these were primarily economic entities, right? They were financed. They were financed by companies, and their purpose was to come over and make some money, right? So the Puritans, of course, in Massachusetts, so we're thinking about like the Pilgrims, right? And of course the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Okay. So a little bit about the economy, actually a lot about the economies of colonial cities. Okay, so the economies of colonial cities were based on trade. What do I mean? So remember, they were established kind of on the coast, and what would happen is, so European like trading vessels would come to the colonies, would come to these colonies. They would come to the New World. And they would establish these colonies on the coast, and the way that they worked is the colonies were kind of outposts where they would send people into the interior, workers into the interior to extract like raw materials from the local region. So think like in the northern colonies, they would send in fur trappers and lumberjacks, which those traders would take back to the cities and put and sell to merchants who would and sell to seafaring merchants who would take those materials back to Europe and manufacture things like fur coats and furniture, right? And these of course would oftentimes be luxury goods, because that's what because they cost a lot of money to be taken all the way from North America back to Europe. Okay, so this was kind of a trade in like luxury goods, oftentimes. In the southern colonies, which were primarily agricultural colonies, the commodities that were traded were agricultural commodities. So places like indigo. Tobacco in places like North Carolina, rice plantations, of course, in like South Carolina and Georgia, sugar mostly for those wondering, sugar in like the Caribbean. right? And cotton did not become. So you notice I didn't put cotton there because cotton did not become kind of major cash crop in North America until a little bit later on. Okay, until the 18th century mostly. Okay, until late 18th century, 19th century. Okay, and so of course, if you're going to have all this trade or whatever, you got to have people to work. So who's doing the work, right? So the work took was done by generally two groups after it was determined that indigenous people were not going to simply lay down and decide to work for Europeans, right? The labor needs of these colonies forced them to go to Europe. Okay, and so we have the first is European indentured servants, right? Somebody help me out. What's an indentured servant? What is that? What's up, Juan? Shalini?
Yeah, Shalini.
Shalini, what's up?
An indentured servant is somebody who will work for you if you pay maybe for their debts and or education or literally just their passage to quote unquote was the new world.
Oh, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. So indentured servants. So these were European indentured servants at the time, mostly like English and German at the time, Dutch. But these were, and essentially what they were. These were impoverished Europeans. So these were like poor Europeans who, remember, I talked about the enclosure movement before. So let's say now that the king has taken the land that you used to rely on to live, and now you're poor because they've taken that and they've given it to some wealthy landholders, and you don't have access to that land, and so now you're really, really poor. What do? Well, then you move to the city, right? Because that's where the work is. That's in order to go and get a job, and that fueled the early industrial revolutions of European cities. But you know what? So many poor people, so many impoverished Europeans were moving into European cities that the monarchs and the administrations of those cities, what they would do then is they would say, okay, they would pass laws because there were all these people there, and they were like becoming beggars because they didn't have any work. They were, so they were jobless people in the cities looking, kind of being beggars and maybe looking for work or whatnot. And so what the European monarchs did is they made it illegal. They passed vagrancy laws and they made it illegal to not have a job. And what they said was, okay, so you can either, they would say to these people essentially, you can either get a job or you can get out, right? You can either get a job or you can get out. And of course, and under penalty, of course, if you don't get a job and you don't get out, then they'll put you, then they'll essentially put you in a workhouse where you will work, essentially for free. Right, and what we will essentially call that, will call that prison. So they essentially put them into prison, in the prison workhouses where they would work for free. So you can imagine that a lot of these people were like, well, I don't want to go to jail, I don't want to go to prison, and I'm not having luck finding a job here. So what they would do is they would get somebody to finance their journey to North America, and because when they get to North America, the way that they pay off that debt, because they couldn't afford to go there themselves, the way they would sell their labor, they would give up their freedom for generally a period of like maybe like 3 to 7 years, where they would work for no wages, but simply to pay off their debts. And essentially, the idea is, of course, once they paid off their debts, then they would become free. Of course, and of course, but this wasn't enough labor. This was not enough labor for the growing needs, particularly in the South, but also in the North, for the growing labor needs of the New World. And so they turned to a new source that they were already familiar with, where they turned to the African slave trade. Of course, so the labor in these colonies was kidnapped. West Africans who were sold as property. Okay, and this established what we're going to call, I know many of y'all have seen this before, probably in high school, the triangular trade. Okay, and so the way that the triangular trade worked is that European traders, merchants, would go to the West Coast. They would sail to the West Coast of Africa, where they would trade manufactured goods. Oftentimes, they would trade manufactured goods to African elites. Okay, and of course, and these African elites would oftentimes use those goods, oftentimes weapons and things like that, to in waging local wars local wars and all, and they would trade the prisoners of war, or allow European access to the interior in order to kidnap people and to put them on sailing ships where they would sail to the New World, to North and South America and the Caribbean, and be sold to would be sold as slaves in the New World, and that is therefore being fulfilling the labor needs of, say, like you see the 13 colonies up there in North America. Okay, in those colonies, and thinking about the southern colonies like South Carolina and North Carolina, enslaved, but also all the way up through Maine, enslaved Africans would work to produce the raw materials that were then placed onto vessels and sent across to Europe and sold in Europe, to manufacture the manufactured goods, which were then taken to Africa. And you see how that works. Okay, so that is the triangular trade that fueled both the economies of North America, the European colonies in North America, and also the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. Okay, I want to move a little bit faster now because there's a lot to say in that part. We're going to talk about revolution and transition, right? So this is when I say revolution, I'm talking about the American Revolution, right? Okay, so cities tended to be places. So cities in the New World in North America tended to be places of significant wealth concentration, intellectual activity, and political power, right? Just as today, right? Much fervor for war against England was generated in cities like Boston. So now remember the Boston Tea Party, New York, and Philadelphia, both of which at different times served as the capital of the United States, right? And of course the Philadelphia Convention, where Constitutional Convention, where their Constitution was ratified, things like that, which then became centers for U.S. administration. Growing economic power and independence led colonial elites right, to revolt and wrest sovereignty from England. So that's, so they were becoming economically powerful because, and they were becoming more and more independent from England. And so, but England was still taxing them, right? England was still taxing them, and they were still subject to English laws, even though they felt that maybe, hey, we can make more money and we can keep our money if we were independent from England, right? So, so the founding fathers, if you will, hatched a scheme to revolt and to seek independence from England in order to keep their own money. And keep access over over the resources that they were extracting from indigenous people and the labor that they were extracting from the poor and African labor. Westward expand. So U.S. Independence fueled the push further into the interior, right? So because of course they're trying to, they take over from European powers. They take over that push into the interior, looking for more resources. They use, of course, poor white settlement, right, to secure the frontier, basically to go and battle indigenous people. So they would essentially they would tell poor whites who were living in the cities and they were destitute and stuff like that, and they would tell poor whites, you can go out there, you can get this land, you can go and take that land, it's yours, it belongs to America, essentially, right? They call it, and they talked about it as the frontier, right? And then, but of course, those poor whites would become kind of the shock troops against indigenous people, because you send poor white folks out, they kind of became kind of cannon fodder, right, against indigenous people. And then once they got into battles with indigenous people, that became a justification for the U.S. state, for the new U.S. state to come in and protect the settlers, right, from indigenous people. This is how indigenous land was essentially like taken. Some historians have argued that the Western frontier was essential for quelling popular discontent in the 19th century U.S. So the way that might work is kind of like a safety valve, where if we're all pent up in the cities and there are no jobs and it seems like there's no opportunity, then people are going to organize and they're going to revolt against the elites. But what if people always saw a way out? There's always a frontier in which people could go, or where people could go and make themselves, right? And make themselves and make some money and make a living on their own. Well, that this idea of the frontier was kind of promoted in order to, in important ways, in order to prevent poor whites prevent poor whites from revolting against white elites. Okay, and of course the ethnic cleansing, this westward expansion was facilitated by the ethnic cleansing of indigenous people. So thinking of like Indian removal early on, and of course the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Okay. Move forward to now the industrial metropolis. So you see, I went from the colonial city into this idea of the industrial metropolis, right? This is the industrial city. Okay, and we switch time periods all the way from the mid 1800s, and you see that the industrial city has a long history that comes all the way up until close to the contemporary day, until the 1960s. Okay, and talk about a little bit about what that industrial city or the industrial metropolis looked like. So, U.S. independence And the interior land grab, right, led to a boom in the incorporation of numerous Midwestern cities in the 19th century, right? I just gave just a few to give us a sense of what I mean. So Detroit early on, right, in 1802, Chicago in 1833, and St. Louis in 23, Cleveland in 1836, Columbus, Ohio in 1816, right? So this is all these bunches of Midwestern cities were incorporated in and around on the other side of the Mississippi River and in that area particularly after Napoleon Bonaparte sold the Louisiana Territory, which was French controlled, to Thomas Jefferson, to the United States under Thomas Jefferson in 1803. This territory was sold to pay off the debts, from the losses that France experienced due to the Haitian Revolution. Okay, so Haiti, enslaved Africans in Haiti revolted. France went to try to tamp down the rebellion and to fight, and they lost. And they suffered lots and lots of losses, and they spent lots of money. And France went to recover some of those losses by selling the Louisiana Territory to the United States, which was essentially doubled the size of the United States in the early 19th century. The Erie Canal in New York, which was finished in 1825. It connects, for anybody who's been up in that area, it connects Lake Erie to the we're in Buffalo, or the Buffalo area, to the Hudson River. Right, and what this did was this provided a water route all from the Atlantic Ocean all the way through all the way to the western edge of Lake Michigan. Right, and this provided for the establishment of numerous Great Lakes cities. So think Milwaukee, Toronto, Buffalo, Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. They were established before this, but they might have been established before this, but they grew large because finally there was an easy way to extract materials from those areas. Through fur and lumber and also agriculture, and then and to be able to make it and trade with Europe through the Erie Canal. So what did these because remember, they're growing a lot, right? So there's bunches and bunches of, they're growing upwards and outwards. So, what they look like. This is when we start, during the 19th century, this is when we started seeing the familiar features of cities that we think of in North America today. This is where we start seeing those familiar features being established, such as skyscrapers, right? The buildings are getting taller. Street grids emerge, right? As economic elites are interested in making the cities more efficient, building cities more efficiently for the purposes of commerce. Right, emerged, they demanded spatial efficiency and legibility, if you will, of the city. So we start seeing that, and this is a picture of the famous Chicago street grid, right? And you see that it kind of goes on for miles because the interior moving in Chicago is on a plane, right? And so of course now we get to talk about the population of this of the industrial metropolis. And because it's like all these people coming, right? And they're growing. And so from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century, cities experienced explosive population growth. um, and they become, unlike with the colonial cities, they become much more diverse. So increasing diversity and immigration, right? Early immigration policy. Prior to the late 1800s, the United States didn't really have much of an immigration policy, right? It was kind of like anybody can come as long as you're not like, you're not bringing like an obvious communicable disease. Anybody could, kind of had access to the United States, right? How this is, and so through before the Civil War generally. However, up to the Civil War, citizenship rights were restricted to only whites, right? So, sure, you could come and you could be an immigrant and you could work, but in terms of doing things like voting and things like that, rights were restricted to whites all the way up to just after the Civil War, when citizenship rights were extended to emancipated blacks. Okay. So early on, early immigrants were Germans.